This is Neon Galactic, a YouTube podcast produced by Keat TV in Eureka, California. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us once again. Charting this unfolding movement, which I now see as a long-needed and almost certainly transformative intellectual revolution, can be a difficult task. The pageantry of names, faces, whole fields of intellectual endeavor, including the sciences and the humanities, as well as educational, commercial, civil, and military institutions, can be utterly mystifying. The UAP subject, which transcends mere lights in the sky to include everything from ancient mystery schools and high technology to consciousness and the shadowy world of spycraft, is more prone to confuse and bewilder than offer anything in the way of definitive answers, at least at this point. There are a few people in this realm who have the expertise and perspective necessary to make sense of some of this, and one of those bright lights is my guest today. Author and journalist Nick Cook has attacked this subject matter from two directions, one that focuses on the technologies that may underpin some of what we're seeing, and another comes at this from the subjective angle of human consciousness. He is here to talk about his new project, a serialized novel currently underway, available by subscription, called The Light Beyond the Mountains. I've reserved my spot in his growing audience for this effort, and so far have been absolutely thrilled to watch it unfold. Nick Cook, welcome to the show again.
Thank you, James. It's really good to be back. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, no problem. I'm super excited about what I've read so far in your project, but do you mind just sort of backing up and giving our viewers a sense of what this project is and how it came to be?
Sure. A minor correction, first of all. It's not a novel, it's nonfiction.
That was one thing I was going to ask you. Is it nonfiction? And I said novel, so I take that back.
But you'd be forgiven for thinking that the prologue was a novel, because I am a novelist as well. I mean, that's something that I do.
Yeah.
And I was sort of taught from a early writing age that if I wanted to engage a mainstream audience, and predominantly that's what I want to do with this book, is bring a mainstream audience on board, because my skepticism in all of this, I see, on my initial skepticism, I see as being the average Joe's initial skepticism.
Absolutely.
So in order to sort of make that more accessible, I shamelessly employ some novelistic techniques to make my nonfiction as readable as possible. So your Freudian slip or your mistake about it being a novel was actually a well-informed one, and it came from a sort of it came from a good place, because that's not entirely unintended. Although I have to say, of course, that everything that happens in the book really happens, and that is being charted for real.
Yeah, no. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the sighting at Area 51. I mean, that sort of starts off your book, and I don't want to give away spoilers, but I want to be able to talk about what's going on. And there's only been there's been a chapter and a prologue so far, and then kind of an introductory write-up. But can you talk a little bit about, as much as you can without revealing too much, the sighting that you've talked about in the book so far, and how that came to affect you and then later push you into a more serious pursuit of this topic?
Sure. It's a really interesting question, this, about, where do you start a book? I've done 25 books in my time, in my life. Wow. Not all of them under my own name, because I'm a ghostwriter on the side as well.
Yeah.
So it's always, though, this question: where do you begin the arc of the story? And I chose to begin this story, the story I'm calling The Light Beyond the Mountains, which, as you say, is being serialized on Substack now. I chose to start it in the prologue with my sighting of something at Area 51. Just to backtrack a little, people might be asking, well, what was he doing at Area 51? Well, I wasn't in Area 51. Sure. I was in the environs of Area 51 in 1992. I was at that time the aerospace editor of a magazine called Jane's Defense Weekly, which was an investigative journal, which at that time, at least on my beat, was trying to get to the bottom of some a plethora of sightings of strange craft seen in the sky in Nevada, in the sort of throughout the 80s and into the early 1990s. In 1989, people may recall somebody called Bob Lazar went public about his revelations of having worked at a place near Area 51, which is buried in the sort of in foothills of the Nevada desert, about 100 miles north of Las Vegas. He said he'd been working at a site called S4, which was a sort of, he maintained was a tributary site of Area 51 itself. And he said that at this site, he'd worked on crash retrieved alien flying saucers. And until that point, the name Area 51 had really not registered on most people's radar screens. It certainly was the first time I'd ever heard it referred to that way. I'd known about Area 51, but I knew it under a different name. I knew it by the name that it was referred to in secret amongst secret, aircraft builders who were building secret aircraft projects, places like the Lockheed Skunk Works. I knew it as Groom Lake. So when I heard this Area 51 revelation, I thought it was about time that I got out there and took a look for myself. So the prologue of The Light Beyond the Mountains tells the story of that, how a former colleague of mine who used to work at Jane's then went on to work for a different publication in California. We journeyed from Reno, Nevada, down through Nevada itself. We navigated then on a very cold, snowy March afternoon in 1992 to a place called Rachel, Nevada, which is the closest habitation spot in the cleared white world to Area 51, which is sealed from the outside world by a very secure border fence. And it's also contained within a place called the Nellis Air Force Ranges, which are about the size of Switzerland, which is pretty extraordinary. So it's impossible, just about, to get into Area 51 without being shot. So we decided we'd camp out in the foothills. We were about 20 miles from the base, overlooking it. And that's where I had this strange sighting, which is what I describe in the book, in the prologue.
Yeah. And I will have a link and, to direct people to your project on Substack. And I encourage people to get on the train here because I think this is going to be a fascinating project. Now, I fancy myself a writer as well. I haven't published 50 books, but I have done my fair share of writing and publishing in various local publications and whatnot. And I understand that it's a giant risk to write a book in serialized form because you aren't able to do a lot of the later edits that you would be able to do if you had the whole manuscript in front of you at one time. Can you talk a little bit about how daunting it might be as an author to sort of undertake that kind of process?
Yeah, I kind of bare my soul a bit in an introduction to the whole book project, which says just how uncomfortable this is for me, because I'm, as I say in this intro, I'm an inveterate chiseler of my own words. You could say that I'm pretty OCD when it comes to editing and re-editing my work, until I'm happy for it to go out. I don't have this luxury this time. I am literally writing it on the hoof. I'm writing it a couple of chapters in advance, so to give me a little bit of time and back up in case, I have a sort of serious edit meltdown. But it's all new for me. And, I am taking my cue. I mean, this is in spirit, not in style or form, from Charles Dickens and his contemporaries, many of whom serialized their books, in the back half of the 19th century. But there is an opportunity here as well, James, for me, which is I feel this is a really interactive project. It deserves to be interactive. And, full disclosure, I had initially thought that I would get it published in a mainstream format as a hard copy book. And I've been working on it for a couple of years. I slammed the whole thing up into a proposal, as I normally would. I submitted this proposal through my agent to a number of publishers. And that was really when the problem started, because it is really hard, or I realized it was really hard, to shoehorn into a proposal of a few thousand words the book that I wanted to write about consciousness. Now, you might ask, why does this book about consciousness start with a UAP sighting at Area 51?
The heart of it, right? That's the heart of the question.
Well, I guess, it is. And it's certainly not intuitive to think that there would be a link between UAP and consciousness. But as this journey unfolds, and bear in mind, I might be writing it fortnight by fortnight, but I've actually mapped the whole book out. I mean, I know the arc of the book. It might change a little bit as I deliver it, but the arc of the book is known to me. So the book is about consciousness. What I realized was, and actually this was from feedback from the publishers, who said to me, "You're not qualified to write about consciousness, Nick. You don't have that qualification." Well, my retort to them was, actually, nobody does, and everybody does, because no one knows what consciousness is. Science doesn't know what consciousness is. I mean, it doesn't know how it comes about, how we are conscious. It just knows that we are conscious. So my retort to them was, actually, I'm every bit as qualified as anyone else to write about it and talk about it, and so is everyone. So that would include all the punters that I'm reaching out to across Substack.
Yeah.
So it was really at that point that I realized this is a book that actually needs to be a conversation rather than a conventional format nonfiction hard copy book, which is what I'm doing on Substack. And I have to say, thrilled to be. It's been out now, or the first chunk was released about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I'm just so grateful to everyone who's signed on for it. And the feedback has been tremendous so far, touch wood.
Yeah. Now, is that something that you think once you're done, you'll have volumes available that people can order and buy as a standalone thing? Or is it always going to be a work that consists of both the reaction you're getting from folks and people will be able to read it online? I mean, is this going to be a standalone book at one point, do you think?
Well, I mean, for the moment, I'm just really enjoying this format. And
Sure.
this is great. Of course, I would hope that as I get into it, and I've got enough material there, and it is, I am employing, as I said earlier, the techniques that I would employ on any other book that I'm writing for a mainstream readership, which is, it is narrative led. It has chapter ends with, I hope, what are kind of cliffhangers. In that sense, it would lend itself, I hope, to a proper, hard copy book at some point in time. So, you never know. The publishers whom I originally approached, or maybe some others, might step in and go, yeah, why don't we see this published as a proper hard copy mainstream book? And that'll be fine by me, but I can't see that happening anytime soon. As I said, in any case, this is, I'm just really enjoying this format. Actually, it's sort of, it's testing me. It's pushing me out of my comfort zone. But I hope in that it's also making me strive to be a bit more creative than I would customarily be were this just an ordinary mainstream book.
And I think absolutely, I think it'll go a long way toward helping to facilitate this conversation around consciousness that I think that we desperately need to have as a culture. And so I think on that level, you're to be commended. You're bringing in a lot of people around a story that you're writing that is raising a lot of topics that I think are going to become even more front of mind as we evolve further into this subject and to the surrounding subjects like consciousness and whatnot. To go back to your sighting briefly, I wonder, when you had that sighting, were you aware of the consciousness connection? Did you feel some sort of consciousness? I don't know how to describe it. Did you feel like there was something deeper than just a physical sighting at that point, or did that come upon reflection?
The short answer to your question is no. I had absolutely zero feeling for this in the process of this sighting at all. And just to go back a bit, I was a very different person in 1992 than the person I am today.
Sure.
And that 1992 me was looking at this through an incredibly different lens. I was the aerospace editor of this magazine, Jane's Defense Weekly.
Which is not just a magazine, it's the preeminent, it's the magazine for the subject. So you were...
Well, Jane's itself, it still is, but it was at the time a kind of empire of publications, which delved into all aspects of the aerospace and defense industry. Very sort of traditional in a way. I mean, it had started out at the back end of the 19th century, but it covered every aspect of that business and other businesses, transport as well. And I was steeped in this nuts and bolts tradition. I had been trained as a cub reporter to go to press conferences about aerospace widgets. I mean, if that doesn't translate into American,
no, it does. It does.
Tiny little components.
We love widgets.
And that was okay, good. You never know. Two great nations divided by a common language. So, but that was my training. And when I saw this thing rise up behind the hills at Area 51, I went into analysis mode, and so did my colleague Guy Norris. We looked at it and we thought, how does this chime at all with anything that we know about in our reference manual? And the short answer was, it didn't. And so I really left the whole thing to one side for a long time, until, as I say in the next chapter, which has also just been released, chapter 1, of The Light Beyond the Mountains, until 2017, when the New York Times published its seminal story on this secret unit that had been buried within the Pentagon called ATIP. And that sort of rekindled a latent sort of interest in me in UFOs and secret technology. I had written, as you know, James, because I think we spoke about it last time, a book called The Hunt for Zero Point. And that came out in 2001, which was all about my quest sort of under hidden auspices, in that it had not been approved by the magazine, but I decided to go off and do it on my own anyway, under the cover of the magazine, into top secret. Well, what I saw as possibly the most secret thing that I could envisage being buried in the American defense establishment, which was a new propulsion or energy source. So the book was in effect about anti-gravity. Had America cracked the anti-gravity code, which in turn would give it a capability that would look not unlike a UFO, of course. So all of this was in my reference manual. And as I saw this thing come up over the hills at Area 51, that's what I was thinking about. But it just stayed completely off my radar screen. I mean, I really didn't even give much thought to any of that stuff in the intervening 2 decades until, as I say, that New York Times piece came out in 2017.
One question that struck me as I was reading through that stuff: would you have ever have written Hunt for Zero Point if you hadn't have had the sighting?
Yeah, I think I would have. The sighting in 1992, although it coincided approximately with the time that I I was beginning my Hunt for Zero Point journey, it didn't influence my thinking at all, funnily enough. I don't recall that sighting being instrumental in my getting into the Hunt for Zero Point. That was other things, and one can, I guess, legitimately ask through a consciousness lens why it is that certain ideas bubble up in your head anyway.
Sure.
But no, that they were very separate, and I would say coincidental, funnily enough.
Yeah, interesting. Now there was another layer when you were writing so you have a sort of a setup, and then the introduction, and then the first chapter. I think that's what's posted so far on your Substack. I was fascinated by what you wrote in the setup, where you're talking about you had this plan to sort of approach the companies that you typically cover with an idea for basically saving the world. And I kind of want to know how that fits in with the rest of the project. I mean, just to give folks a sense, and they really should go to the Substack and check it out for themselves. But you were basically saying that it occurred to you that if these companies had figured out a way to make the money, to make it pencil out, that they could turn all their expertise toward getting us out of all the problems that are currently threatening our planet and our society. And you held meetings with some of these folks, they're chief technology officers, I believe, and said, is that actually something that you think you could do? And they were like, yes, but we don't have the business model for it. I mean, and you framed the conversation that way. I'm wondering how that plays out and what's later to come. And I have a lot of questions about that idea. I mean, could they really save the planet? And does that mean that they're holding something back at this point that could be pivotal toward that effort? And then there's the question of if they have, UAPs right now, letting them keep that technology in order to save the world, to a lot of people might seem like you're rewarding the bad behavior of hiding the technology, but who else is going to know what the heck to do with it besides the companies that have been researching it for the last 50 years? There's a lot of issues there. So can you talk a little bit about how that plays into this, and is that something you're still pursuing?
So
there's a lot there.
Yeah. So, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
So I remained Jane's Defense Weekly's aerospace editor until about 2005. I then I transitioned out into a different field. I became a consultant, but in the transition period, which was roughly 2005 to maybe 2007, I had proposed a series of articles to the magazine, which I called Technology Audit. Technology Audit was bold or stupid, depending on your viewpoint, in that what I pitched to my editor was that I would go to each of the 9 aerospace and defense sector primes that are in the Western world. They're pretty common household names: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Airbus, Saab, Raytheon,
Yeah.
There's 9 of them. And I would ask these companies whether I could profile their science and technology now, with a view to then extrapolating what those companies would be doing in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. And my editors said, good luck, because that's normally what companies want to keep secret. They don't want to divulge that kind of stuff. It's irrespective of it being classified secret, it is proprietary, a lot of it, commercially proprietary. So I said, okay, well, will you just let me have a crack at it? And I thought the way to have a crack at it is actually to go directly to the companies themselves and pitch it to them on the basis that they'd be getting some pretty good publicity out of this. Well, the companies came back to me and went, no dice, because my editors guessed it. There's a lot of commercially secret and proprietary stuff in our science and technology basements, and we really don't want to share them with a journalist. So I went, well, I said, why don't you reconsider it? Because actually, there are 9 of you companies, you all do the same kind of thing. And what I'm trying to establish is how you differentiate yourselves from each other. What makes Saab different in its capabilities from a Boeing or a Lockheed? Because actually you all do the same stuff. So the differentiator has got to be about your know-how, the way you stitch things together. It's called systems integration. There was lots of sort of buzzy stuff, buzzwordy stuff that I threw at them to try and get them to bite. And actually, eventually they did. They said, okay, yeah, we get that. So, and I did this through a pitch to their chief technology officers. And as I say in the intro to this thing, a lot of those CTOs came on the journey with me, because tacitly what they were saying was, even we don't know what's going on in these huge multinational companies of ours at a sort of basement level. I mean, broadly they do, of course they do.
Yeah.
But the idea was that we both learned on this journey. So I went and did this journey. I amassed a whole lot of data. I'd got about halfway through the 9, so maybe 4 or 5 companies in, and I suddenly had this kind of insight, which was, blimey, these companies, they might all look the same, but they have knowledge that goes from subsea, under the ocean surface, all the way to orbit, and then through into space, and even into interstellar space, about our environment. And yet only a fraction of that knowledge, that know-how, is being used in a customer capacity. And that's all going, or most of it's going onto defense programs, some of it's going onto commercial airliner programs, civil aircraft programs, and some of it is going into satellite programs, including Earth remote monitoring satellites. But actually, if you put all of that knowledge together, I said, you've got the wherewithal to save the planet. And I brought all the CTOs together, bar one, at a conference in Washington, D.C., with President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, in 2011. And it was amazing, because it was the first time these guys had ever shown up together at one table. And I asked them the question straight. I said, this is a paraphrase. Can you save the planet? And they went, yeah, we can save the planet. Then they said what you said, James, which is, but our business model does not allow us to do that, because we contract with governments. We don't do anything at our own risk. We always get government to pay for whether it's development or production of something. So unless governments tell us to, quotes, go save the planet, we can't. We won't. It's not in our business DNA. So I thought, this is insane.
Yeah.
We've got to, the planet is in trouble, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And these 9 companies have this phenomenal capacity to go and do this thing. And yet they can't, they're hamstrung by their business model. So I worked with a couple of them, several of them, over the next 2 or 3 years, to try and shift that business model, to try and vary the business model, to give them a commercial front end that would allow them to operate in the commercial world, where a lot of clean tech development takes place. And it wasn't just this idea that defense companies and aerospace companies save the world. Of course, what you have to do is you have to get everyone involved. But what aerospace and defense does, like no other sector, is it pulls together huge architectures. So if you're looking at big regional environmental cleanup systems, you might want to go and get a big aerospace and defense company to go and put that architecture together. So for a while, there was this fantastic sort of window in which all of this stuff was being talked about by all of these companies. It was tremendously exciting. And then in 2014, we had 2 things happen. We had ISIS pop up, Islamic State,
Yeah.
and, just doing the terrible things that it was doing. And then also Russia annexed Crimea. And those 2 things were enough to sort of pour a bucket of cold water collectively over the aerospace and defense sector. And they kind of went, it's time we went back to business as usual. So that sadly never happened. But what I'm saying in the Substack, in this conversation around the light beyond the mountains, is I'd like to just reinvigorate that conversation. And it's not just about getting the aerospace and defense sector involved in re-engaging with the environment, with climate change, the climate emergency, and all of that stuff. But it's now let's bring consciousness into this discussion as well, so that we're looking at everything through a new science model, a model that I think is emerging, which is a consciousness-led first model. And when we look at the world through that prism, I think that we see it in a very different way. And I've only just started out on that road. We're only on chapter 1. We're about to go to chapter 2. But this is where the journey is going to take us ultimately. And I'm not plot spoiling here, because I lay the arc out in the introduction, more or less. What you are going to get, though, in the narrative are the beats that got me there. And those, as I said earlier, they're skeptical beats. There are real skeptics' scrutiny on what the makeup of our reality is, why we generally accept the reality that we accept, which is this hard physical world out there, wherein I'm here, the world of things is out there, and never the twain shall meet. Well, consciousness tells us, or indicates, that that's not true, that there's something else at work, and that everything is actually hyperconnected. So that's where the story is going, and that's what you get a flavor of in the first couple of chapters of this book.
Yeah, and it sets a hard hook, or a sharp hook, man. I'm like riveted by that whole conversation. I have a lot of questions about, that fact that they may have the wherewithal to begin to address a lot of what seems like intransigent problems having to do with the planet, and they're sitting on this technology, but they don't have a way to make money. Part of me wonders, well, what does a business model that is bent on saving the planet look like? Does it mean that our governments would have to not focus on being the biggest bully with the biggest stick in the neighborhood, and rather focus on cooperating within these 9 companies to find those solutions? That's one question. And then the other question is, do these companies know, are they operating under the assumption that consciousness is way more pivotal than what we've been led to believe as a scientific paradigm?
Okay, so on the cooperative piece, no one, least of all me, is saying throw away a defense model. I'm not saying that. We all need.
But maybe that's what we need to do. I know that it's impractical.
It's a fact of life. Yeah. We need sustainable levels of defense. The key word is sustainable.
Yeah.
Because once you get yourself into an arms race situation, it then becomes unsustainable. Look at Russia at the moment. It is putting 40% of its industrial capacity into arms production. That is burning brightly for them right now. The economy is doing great guns, but it isn't going to be sustainable. It's going to collapse at some point, which is worrying in and of itself, because before it collapses, you almost have to go and discharge this energy buildup of war production that you've built up. No, I'm not saying throw away your defense arms and your weapon systems and all of that stuff at all. Hopefully one day that is a state that we will get to. But sustainable levels of defense means we have to reinvigorate a conversation around dialogue, I think, in the world, sooner than just throw a weapon system at a problem. I think that's part of it. But the bigger part for me is how all sectors can and should be coming together to talk about how technology can engage with the climate emergency and other environmental problems. And I think that, as I would say, because I came from a reporting discipline on that sector, that the aerospace and defense sector has a huge role to play in that. But in order for it to do so, to get back to that business model issue, it has to get government to say to it, this is what we, government, want you to do. Because they literally follow government instruction.
Sure.
And they follow government money. So to recap, don't throw away, don't stop the day job, which is building sustainable levels of defense equipment for our safety and security, but engage in another conversation, which is about how do we share the expertise we have built up, oh, by the way, based on taxpayer money.
I was going to just say that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we paid for a lot of it.
Yeah, exactly.
So
right.
how do we share that knowledge and know-how and the technology with other sectors who are on the front line of the environmental issue to build a better, safer world, safer environments and ecosystems? Consciousness. Do they know about consciousness? I mean, are they looking at this through a consciousness prism? I don't think so, James. I mean, unless there are buried departments somewhere which have some, arcane interest in consciousness. I mean, having said that, there are sort of indications that they are interested in it. For example, I was talking to an aerospace engineer the other day who said that they had been working on a cockpit system, so pilot in the cockpit, which was tapping into the sixth sense of the pilot. We often talk about a pilot having a sixth sense that goes beyond the sensors of the aircraft itself, the radar systems, the infrared search and track systems, and all of that malarkey. This was about plugging the pilot's witchy sense of, oh, I think something's not quite right here. There's somebody following me, somebody on my six. And that pilot's intuition is often right. So they were talking to me about how they were trying to make that into a sort of, a system that you could build into the cockpit. So in a sense, that is plugging into consciousness. But I don't think in its wider sense that the aerospace and defense sector has this broader interest in consciousness. Not that I've come across anyway.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, my question is, do they know that the paradigm is wrong in terms of how we conceive of reality, and they don't know how to implement that knowledge, or it's not something that they can pencil out to again, toward a bottom line, so it doesn't really figure into anything that they're doing, so they just leave it be?
Well, of course, so now we jump into the UAP domain.
Absolutely.
And because there is an argument, I've heard it said, amongst people who have spoken to people who have been involved in some of these crash retrieved ET type technology programs, that Congress is currently saying the aerospace and defense sector has knowledge of, and in certain cases has squirreled away in their science and technology basements. It is said that they are having trouble making it work. Now, why is that? If we've had this crash retrieved technology for 80 some years, how on earth could it have taken 8+ decades for us to figure out how to make these things fly? Well, they then say that consciousness, the way that the pilot, if that's the right word, plugs into the architecture of the craft, is integral to making it work. And I rather suspect that to be true in actual fact. And that there's a corollary to that as well, which is that if we live as science is increasingly saying we do, in an information-rich universe, actually more than that, a universe that is founded fundamentally on information, then to tap, that information process is a sort of feedback mechanism. We feed information, our own information as conscious agents, into the universe. We get feedback from the universe. And there is an argument too that if in this very fluid, reappraised understanding of what makes up our reality set, not the materialist reductionist, as I bang my hand down on this desk to know that it is solid matter, not that universe, but a more fluid one based on consciousness primary. I don't see any recognition of that shift that is coming for certain in the aerospace and defense sector. I do see it in science. I mean, even though mainstream science is clinging on desperately to its, the science models that have sustained it over the past century, to wit, general relativity of Einstein's, big picture universe, the micro universe of quantum mechanics, people are clinging to that model still, but it is shifting, and it's shifting because those anomaly data sets pertaining to anomalous phenomena like UAP, like remote viewing, like mediumship, like ghosts. I mean, you name it.
Yeah, NDEs, OBEs, all of that.
NDEs, OBEs, exactly. All of that stuff. Mainstream science can only handle that by discarding it, by pushing it to one side and saying it's rubbish, it's kooky nonsense, it's not real. But as is increasingly being accepted, they deserve a look, because our big picture science models are stuck. We have fudges like dark matter and dark energy, which make up 95% of the known universe, but no one knows what it is.
Yeah,
they're just placeholders, for science to go, well, we don't know what these are, but so we'll call them dark energy and dark matter, and then we'll get on with the 5% of the stuff that we do see.
Mm-hmm.
So I think mainstream science is getting to grips with all of that. I see it coming far faster at us than I ever thought would be possible 5 years ago. A lot of that, I think, is to do what's happening on Capitol Hill, where Congress and the Senate is getting its teeth into the whole UAP question. But it's also happening because science is fundamentally stuck, and it needs to explore new frontiers in order to get new clues to the nature of reality.
Yeah, I recently had Bernardo Kastrup on my show, and he had an interesting point to make about there are people who talk about science, the Neil deGrasse Tyson folks or whoever, who play sort of a gatekeeper role and kind of try and interpret scientifically for the public things that are happening in the innovative spheres of development. And then there's people who are actually in the labs, and his idea or his thinking is that the shift is occurring and it's active right now with people who actually have their hands on a lot of these intractable issues, but that hasn't filtered down to the people who pontificate about science because they have become disconnected to the laboratories and the frontiers of science. I don't know enough about what Neil deGrasse Tyson and other folks like that actually do to know if that's true or not, but it certainly resonated with me that they do seem rather dismissive and disconnected of things that there are mountains of evidence backing up, and it just seems like that they don't bother to engage with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not against science. I come from a discipline that was embedded in a science model. I mean, that discipline being the engineering discipline of aerospace and defense. So I'm not against it. I'm just frustrated because, like so many people, I'm a curious soul, and I see all kinds of stuff which looks to me like data. I can't understand why that data around anomalous phenomena is ignored by science. If I were a scientist, that's where I'd be going. I'd be going to that place, and I'd be looking at those data sets, and I would be saying, how is it that they cross-correlate across multiple silos? How is it that somebody who's pop some psychedelic substance and is transported into a realm wherein they feel that they are experiencing a far deeper reality than we customarily experience, how is it that their experience is not that dissimilar from someone who's having a near-death experience? Those to me are data sets that correlate across silos. And of course, science says, well, it's subjective, so you can't, you should discount it. It's objective reality that we're interested in. Well, I would counter and say, in fact, many people do counter and say, there is intersubjectively verifiable data.
Absolutely.
In that what an experiencer in one of those silos is talking about correlates with the data that an experiencer from another silo is talking about.
Yeah. It seems
data.
like
It might not be science data, but it's data.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. Like, you feel like, and I get it, that you have to say, I'm not anti-science. I'm saying that I wish science would take these anomalies seriously. And that is science, right? I mean, we talk about like Thomas Kuhn with like the revolutions and paradigms of science. And like, we have to be willing to look at the anomalies in order to assess whether our paradigms are faulty or not. And people get so married to the paradigm because their work has been spent over, they spent 50 years of their work buttressing those paradigms, that to undermine them makes their whole research career irrelevant. So there becomes a cul-de-sac, I guess, in that regard, and that's unfortunate.
And we are though, James. I mean, to that point, we are literally witnessing a Kuhn paradigm shift in motion.
Yeah.
Because that outlier data, which is the sort of the first indicator you get of a coming paradigm shift, is slowly but surely being enfolded into the mainstream. And it won't be long, I don't think, before the heretical stuff, the outlier data, is grows and grows and grows, and then we get the shift, the tilt happening, and that, as I said earlier, seems to be happening at exponential speed.
Yeah, that's part of what I'm trying to do with my show here, is that like talking about UAPs is a way for me to get beyond the idea of whether UAPs exist or whether these anomalies are true, and kind of operates from the assumption that they are true, and what does it mean for where we're going as a culture and society into the future. That's the exciting stuff for me. And to think about what a paradigm shift like that might mean for people individually and us collectively, and yes, maybe even spiritually, although that's a dirty word. I mean, those are all the questions that I'm supremely interested in, and talking to folks like you gives me a whole lot of perspective that I wouldn't have had before. One question I wanted to ask you about, now you were talking to these folks from the the military industrial complex or whatever, and they were taking you into their basements to sort of see what they had and how that might play out in terms of saving the world. Did you ever get the sense, and I mean, coupled with your research from the Hunt for Zero Point, that they were hiding a massive something? And they're like, oh yeah, don't go over in that corner because that's really where the cool stuff is. And then beyond that, we hear a lot of accusations about, bad behavior, even murder. I mean, Grush has almost come out right and said that he knows people who have been hurt, threatened, and maybe even killed because of their efforts at pushing that stuff toward public view. Do you ever get the sense in working with these folks that they are capable of that kind of behavior?
I think I say this in the introduction to the new book, the Substack introduction, that my experience of the aerospace and defense sector is very different, was very different from the perceptions or the sort of portraits that are bandied around, on social media and wherever. I'm not saying that there aren't, bad people in the sector. Heavens, there are millions of people in it. Of course there are going to be. But, my experience of it was talking to engineers predominantly, sometimes program managers. Well, actually, often I would speak to program managers as well. But, an engineering community and a sort of executive community. And by and large, they are people just like you and me who are doing a job.
Yeah.
it just happens that the architecture of the US aerospace and defense industry contains a much bigger secret component than most, I mean, certainly European companies do. There's a very different flavor or atmosphere within a European company than there is to a big American defense contractor. I loved going to the States when I was on my Jane's beat, because that's always where the sort of really sexy, interesting program work was going on. And a lot of it was secret, and a lot of it was black world secret. So if I came across it, and if I asked questions about it, the program official that I was asking the questions of was legitimately entitled to lie to me to cover that program up.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's what a black program allows you to do, a SAP,
Yeah.
secure special access program. So, so, you know, is it a bad place? You know, universally, no. Are there, you know, dark corners within it? Yes, absolutely there are. I never found myself in a quotes basement of one of these companies witnessing technology I couldn't explain. There were a number of times when I went into these companies. I remember once, I describe it, I think, in The Hunt for Zero Point, where I went into the Skunk Works in Palmdale in the mid 1990s to interview one of their chief executive, the boss of the Skunk Works, a guy called Jack Gordon. And after I'd conducted the interview, I was being escorted out of the headquarters building, which just happened to be in the secure part of the company.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw an org chart. There was a sort of chart with all of the aircraft types from 1944, which is when the Skunk Works started, right up to the then present day. And at the top of that chart, there were a couple of planes. Well, there was one plane I'd never heard of, which happened to be below the plane that I had heard of, which was, I think it was the Dark Star drone. And this thing was called Astra. And I said to my escort, I said, "What's Astra?" And at that point, I'm sort of bundled out of the building, literally almost picked up, bundled out of the building. And like a horribly annoying child, I keep saying all the way back to the sort of PR building, "What's Astra? What's Astra? What's Astra?" And they say, you know, "We'll let you know." Well, they eventually let me know. They said, "Oh, it was an airliner project that we studied in the 1970s that got canned." And I went, "Okay, all right, you know, I get it. You know, I saw something I'm not supposed to see. Ha ha ha."
Yeah.
Well, the black world is not averse to playing tricks on you, of course, or jokes, because many years later, I was reviewing some old diaries, and I came across the diary in which, on the day that I went to pay this visit to the Skunk Works, and I noticed that it was April the 1st, April Fool's Day. So these guys were playing a little trick on me, I think. And of course, you know, it's sort of innocent, but it's not, because the intention is that I go away and I write up that I've seen something on a board in the Skunk Works called Astra. And then the Russians get hold of that, or the Chinese, or whoever, and they think, "Oh gosh, the Skunk Works is developing something called Astra," and they go off and spend, you know, billions of rubles or whatever on something to shoot it down. That's the way the game works. And yeah, so I've seen secret stuff, but it wasn't so exotic that I couldn't explain what it was. Murder, nah, I never. Yeah, just it didn't come across my radar scope at all. But you know, as you know, James, I write thrillers too. So maybe if I were to go down that avenue, I could sort of, you know, flam up a bit of a plot that would encapsulate that. In my experience, that's not the world of aerospace or defense that I experienced. I'm not saying it can't happen. It's just that I never experienced it.
Yeah, you know, I mean, as long as I've got you here, there's a point in a lot of Diana Pasulka's books where she's talking about the secret space program and folks that are in the black programs who are almost isolated from the rest of society, and they have money flowing through their bank accounts that isn't really accounted for by the work that they're doing, and their children are often segregated in ways, and they are sometimes recruited as young people. And I mean, it suggests a lot of weird stuff. Did you ever come across anything like that, where there was a cultural element, a segment that was somehow, recruited and maintained, that had something to do with the black programs, but it's unclear what or why?
Well, yeah, that black world is mysterious enough. It's
Sure.
and it's very isolating. So let's go back to Area 51, which is where we started off.
Yeah.
Area 51 is a test base. It tests top secret aircraft. There are company facilities on the base. So, a detachment from Lockheed would have been on the base to supervise the testing of the F-117 stealth fighter in the late 1970s and early 1980s. To get to the base, you would go fly from a top secret terminal at McCarran Airport, as it was then in Las Vegas. They were called Janet flights. They flew, all they did was shuttle to and from Groom Lake or Area 51, operating as an airline 5 days a week, or maybe 6 days a week. That is an incredibly isolating world if you're an aerospace engineer. If you sign up to that, you are isolated from the get-go. It isn't hard to imagine how you then get spirited into something even more exotic. But again, my experience then, back in my Jane's days, stopped at talking to people who had knowledge of those emerging technologies like stealth and hypersonics, which, as I say, was secret enough. And I knew, that if I crossed certain thresholds and boundaries, I was going to get into trouble. I wasn't sure what that trouble was, but you could. If I were in the UK, I would have been, and I'd tripped over something like that, I might have been slapped with the Official Secrets Act, because that's how we in the UK deal with those sort of breaches, where somebody, a journalist like me, would have crossed into a top secret threshold. It never happened to me, I have to say, but I do know journalists that did happen to here. So yeah, it's an isolating. I think it can be a very scary world if you're in it. And one more story which illustrates it, which comes to mind. I did a documentary in 1999 called $1 Billion Secret, which came out here in the UK on Channel 5, but in America it came out on the Discovery/Learning channel. In it, I interviewed a guy who was then in his 80s called Bob Widmer. Bob had been a designer at a company called Convair, which became General Dynamics, which in turn became Lockheed. And he was still a consultant in his 80s when I interviewed him at Lockheed in about 1998. I started to talk to him about a hypersonic program that he'd worked on called Kingfish, and a subsidiary program called Fish. These were for Mark IV plus hypersonic reconnaissance aircraft flying very high, very fast. The Kingfish program actually bid against the A-12 Blackbird and lost. But weirdly, the loser in that program remained classified. So Kingfish was classified still when I spoke to Widmer in 1998, 30 odd years after they had lost against the Lockheed Blackbird. How can that be, that a losing submission remains classified? As I started to talk to him, he became more and more concerned, became incredibly twitchy, starts looking over his shoulder at the minder who is behind him. Can I talk about this stuff? I'm concerned, but of course I'm doing my job. I'm asking him questions. This is the realm of the secret world. And Widmer says, actually, at the end of it, he said, I wouldn't wish it on anyone. It's, even in what I was doing, Bob Widmer, it was a scary place. So dial that up a bit and imagine what it must be like if you were working on something truly secret, that was truly secret, but truly exotic, like crash retrieved UAP material. It's off the charts.
Yeah. And there's so much invested in terms of national security and money and everything else that it's easy to see how an individual could get pinched by the titanic forces at play in that kind of a situation. We're about out of time. I wanted to ask you real quick. I mean, one thing that is really arresting about this project is that despite the confusion, despite the black projects, despite the presence of the military-industrial complex and all of those things, and then also the situation that we're in as a world, your project is positing something hopeful, that maybe we actually have the mechanisms to save the planet and to save ourselves and to break ourselves out of this cul-de-sac paradigm of materialism, and that there may be a way forward. We just have to find a way to incentivize that work and make it go in that direction. Can you talk a little bit about how important it is to stay hopeful in spite of all these challenges, and realize that we're in the process of becoming something, and so there's no reason to give up hope. We just got to keep pushing for the changes that we want to see?
Well, thank you, because that is such a good question, and it's a really good place to sort of start winding down. The title of the book is not coincidental. I call it, The Light Beyond the Mountains, for a reason. Actually, there are a number of reasons. One of them is quite prosaic. It starts off, as we've been discussing, around Area 51, and literally, when you're in the Nevada desert doing a sort of watch on Area 51, hundreds of miles or a long way from anywhere, the only light you can see is the light beyond the mountains from Area 51, from the base itself. Yeah. So that's a sort of a nod to the prologue of the book. But the wider sense is of the light beyond the mountains is one of hope, as you say. We are faced with, Bernardo Kastrup talks about this, a particularly challenging 20 years ahead. We're faced with regional conflict, nuclear armed conflict. We're faced with a climate emergency. We're faced with meltdowns in, the artificial intelligence world. And we have a kind of ramping up discussion around UFO and UAP disclosure. All of these are sort of converging in I was about to say in an alarming way. They are alarming, of course, but they're converging in a meaningful way, I think, as well. And I think that we have to, this is all, as you imply in your question, James, about us changing too. These are forcing functions in a way that are forcing us to change. Some people are probably going to, double down and be even more embedded than they were in the old ways, the current ways of, materialist reductionist science. But I think there will be a loosening too of the bonds that tie us to all of that. And we begin to go inward. We look at ourselves. We look at the connections that bind all of us. We look at the connections that bind us to reality and the deeper realms of reality beyond that, to go, well, if reality isn't what we think it was, how can we reshape the world in a more hopeful light? And that's really what this is about. As I say, it's not plot spoiling, because I'm not giving any of the waypoints of that journey away yet. Sure. It comes throughout the book. But ultimately, I hope that we will all end up in a good place. I mean, with we all end up in a good place because of this. I mean, I think there are going to be some bumps in the road, obviously, but we have to engage, and we have to engage in a different way from any conversation we've had in the past. Because if we don't, we will have some problems ahead, no question. So yeah, I'm hopeful, and I'm excited as well because, as I say in the intro, I want to get a conversation going. I mean, I'm already getting a conversation going with people who want to affect positive change, at a quite a high level. And my previous experience in getting those defense companies to come together at CTO level, which I thought, to be honest, a decade ago was wasted. I'm not wasted. It was all good experience, but I couldn't see where that road led to.
Yeah.
Well, it's led here.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, in the most unexpected way I could imagine. But then that seems to be the way of consciousness as well. It seems to have a means of putting you exactly where you're meant to be at the appropriate time, which sometimes, mostly, you can only see when you look back on the events themselves. So yeah, I'm hopeful, and I'm excited because I think this conversation is really now beginning to ramp up.
Well, I tell you what, when I started this podcast, all I wanted was to be a part of the conversation and to talk to folks like you and learn as much as I could. So it's been a fantastic privilege to talk about your new project and to figure out where you're going. And I'm going to be avidly, every 2 weeks, right, checking for my chapter update to see where this is all going. But it's fascinating, and I truly appreciate you sharing your time with us.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back on the show, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no, and we'll have to have you back again someday, soon.
I'd love that.
All right, sir. Thank you so much.